Hello and welcome to A Ready Defense. My name is Joe Puckett and I'm glad that you joined me with this particular lesson. I'm excited about thinking with you about this particular subject. For the last couple of lessons, we've been talking about the death of Jesus, what the sacrifice of Christ means, what the Bible says about it, and basically what made sense of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ who came into this world. So, on the heels of that, though, we also want to talk about, and we cannot leave out the resurrection because they go together. The sacrifice of Jesus and the resurrection is seen in Scripture as a package. And when the good news is preached, the good news is seen as the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the resurrection was the pinnacle truth, is the central truth of Christianity. So much so that the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that if Christ isn't risen, then we're all hopeless. He says in verse 18 of that chapter, "And those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are all men most pitiable." It's pointless. Christianity is simply not true if Jesus is not raised from the dead. But here's the flip side. If Jesus is raised from the dead, then Christianity and the entire package of the story of the Bible is true. And when we think about, okay, for those who accept that God exists, and we are for this particular lesson, we've talked about that in the past, but for those who accept that, and accept that God had created the world, then there should be no trouble accepting the fact that God could raise anyone from the dead. The same goes vice versa. If you accept that Jesus rose from the dead, you shouldn't have any trouble accepting any other miracle, including creation, because they all stand or fall together. But Jesus Christ and Him crucified and Him having been raised from the dead, demonstrating that He had power over death and defeated death, is the central claim of the Christian truth. So is that true? Did Jesus raise from the dead? Well, the first thing I want to say is the vast majority of scholars, believers and unbelievers alike, they acknowledge Jesus, the Christ, lived in the first century. They acknowledge that this Jewish man by the name of Jesus taught these things that many of which the teachings are outlined in the Gospels. Just from a historical perspective and point of view, Jesus was alive, and there is that. In fact, there is more evidence that Jesus Christ walked the earth than Julius Caesar. We have more ancient evidence for that. Nobody questions whether or not Julius Caesar was an emperor of Rome, but or Nero or anything like that. So we have abundant evidence outside the Bible even. We have people like Tacitus who wrote about and confirmed, who wrote in the first century, by the way, and wrote that Jesus Christ died at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and He died by crucifixion. And Tacitus was a Roman historian, not a believer, not a Christian, and he writes about it. We've got Josephus, who alludes to Jesus Christ and His followers, who wrote in the first century. We've got Suetonius, who wrote in the first century, who alludes to Jesus Christ and His followers. And all of these, and so much more, Pliny and so forth. None of these writers who are writing outside the Bible, who wrote in the first century, with inside of even 100 years of Jesus walking the earth, nobody questions the historicity of Jesus. Nobody does. In fact, just maybe some modern scholars, so-called, there are some who still kind of question Jesus, but they're just on the peripheral. That's very, very few and far in between. The modern scholarship, Jesus Christ was alive. He was a Jewish man, died at the hands of Pontius Pilate, etc. So crucifixion is unquestioned historically. What about the burial? Jesus Christ was buried after His death. That makes common sense, but also the historical writings validate that as well. It makes common sense because when we think of the religion of the Jews, it was critically important to bury the dead. Even the enemies of Jesus would not have allowed Jesus' body to be left unburied because they would have seen the land and the Bible, the Old Testament, they saw in their traditions that the land would have been impure and unclean. And this was the Passover time. They needed the land and the people to be clean for the Passover. So they absolutely would have wanted Jesus to be buried. They would not have stopped that in any way, shape, or form. And what Scripture teaches and tells us, again, just from a historical point of view, it makes sense. There was this rich man by the name of Joseph Arimathea who seemed to be well known at that time. He had apparently came to believe in Jesus. Him and Nicodemus both took Jesus' body and they requested to take the body and to bury it. Pontius Pilate agreed to that because, again, he didn't want any trouble with the Jews, and he knew that how important it was to bury a body. So it makes sense historically, common sense, and biblically. All testify to the fact that, of course, Jesus, his body would have been buried. And it wouldn't have been something they would have just made up, because that would be easily verifiable. Just imagine writing in the first century, if you're a Christian writing within 100 years of these things happening, and you're preaching and you're teaching the stuff, and you're saying Joseph of Arimathea is the one who buried Jesus, that would be easily verifiable. The enemies of Christ would have went to Joseph and Arimathea. They could have checked it out very easily, and they could have discredited that. And things that point would have been totally just ignored and taken away altogether. But it just makes sense. There's no reason whatsoever to reject both the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. So the question becomes, what happened to the body? Maybe it just stayed in the tomb. Maybe it was taken somewhere else and people buried it somewhere else. Well, there's a real problem with that. Number one, we know that they could not have done that publicly. If Jesus just stayed there in the tomb, he would be in the tomb to this day. Or if he was taken somewhere publicly and they did some honorary burial somewhere, then we would know exactly where that was. We would know where the body. Take Muhammad in the Islamic faith. We know where he's buried. It's an honorary place. We could take Buddha, and we could take a lot. You could take whatever religious leader you can think of, and pretty much all of them. We know where they're buried. Any major religion. We know where these religious leaders are, except for one, Jesus. Now, don't you think that the way, even Christians today, think of the Catholic Church and others, the way they memorialize certain relics and objects and treat as holy, even and they enshrine certain things that even possibly could represent something that belonged to Jesus in the first century. They honor that, and it's absolutely treated, and people go from all over the world to honor some of these relics, these things. Well, if Jesus was buried, don't you think that would have been maintained throughout history, and we would know where it is, and people would be going to it to honor it and flock to it? Well, no, that's not happening. But it would. We could conceive that as to be the case if Jesus stayed buried. So, but he's not. There is nowhere. We don't know where his burial was. We got an idea. There's a couple of places in Jerusalem where they believe his burial may have been. We don't know 100%. We got an idea where, and if we're right about where, it's empty. There's no body, and so it just sort of disappeared off the face of the planet. Well, the Gospels claim that the reason why the tomb is empty is because Jesus was raised from the dead. All right, so just from a historical, just like thinking history, we can establish the death, the burial, resurrection, and we can establish that the tomb was empty. Most scholars even agree with that. Even unbelieving scholars, they agree to this historically. There seems to be no historical reason to deny that or reject that. The differences come into how do you explain the empty tomb. So some unbelievers say, well, what probably happened was that there's one view called the swoon theory. What probably happened is that Jesus, while he was beaten, while he was scourged and whipped, and while he was put on the cross, and while he was stabbed in the side, all of that which the Gospels attest to, and while he was buried and put in a tomb, what must have happened is he didn't really die. People just thought he was dead. And he revived, and then he was able to get out of the tomb, and then he showed himself to other people, and people just kind of tradition took it that he was raised from the dead. Well, interesting view, but it makes no sense. It conflicts with the historical documents. It conflicts with common sense. So the documents that we have, just considering them historically, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nothing gives that hint. All of them attest to the fact that he was raised, and that was the explanation, that he did in fact die first. That's what I want to say, that he did in fact die. But also you think about the professions of these Roman soldiers that was overseeing the crucifixion. Romans, they took pride in crucifixion, in the effectiveness of crucifixion. They would not have allowed somebody, no way would they have allowed somebody to live through a crucifixion. They would have ensured that these people who were crucified was dead. The reputation of the emperor and the authority of Rome rested on that. And so these soldiers were professionals. They knew when somebody was dead or not. And that's why they stabbed the side of Jesus, to ensure that when the text says that blood and water spilled out, that's an indication potentially even of inflamed heart, where there's fluids building up around the pericardium, and the stabbing of the side is probably that pericardium breaking open where water, fluid, and blood was coming out. So that's evidence, and I'm not a doctor, but that's what doctors say, and that makes sense to me. That's evidence that he was dead. So the spear to the side confirms that he was dead. Also, just think of the crucifixion itself and the anguish, and that having happened after he was scourged. He was scourged dozens of times. So I think it was 39 times, one shy of 40, if I remember correctly. So Jesus was scourged. What does that mean? He was whipped, not just with leather laces, you think of a whip, but rather Roman scourges had little chips of bone, metal pieces, hooks, little stones. They made it to where when they whipped the back, that it would tear away at the skin. It would tear the skin even down to the muscle as they would go and go. And these guys, again, were professionals. They knew how to cause pain. In fact, as I understand it, history tells us that there had been some people who died just from the scourging. So Jesus was scourged, and even at that, it was after he was beaten, punched, slapped, all of that. So Jesus absolutely, I would say, was probably near dead when he was crucified in the first place. Because then they had him carry his own cross, and he was so weak he couldn't continue to carry the cross. He fell, and they had someone help Jesus carry the rest of his crucifix the rest of the way up to the hill where they crucified him. So everything points to the fact that Jesus was nearly in the process of dying. He was weak, and he was losing blood. But they crucified him, and then we're supposed to believe he survived all that, and then he survived the stabbing of the side, and then we're to think that Jesus survived being in the tomb for days, a few days, and he all of a sudden became alive. He revived, and he had enough energy and strength to move a heavy stone that they would use to cover the tomb by himself? No, nobody could have moved that stone by themselves. And even if they were fully healthy, they couldn't remove a stone like that by themselves in the way that these stones in these tombs were so heavy and large. But on top of it, Jesus was so weak and he needed medical care if he was somehow alive. He's probably barely breathing if he was even alive, which there's no possible way he's alive in the first place, but it just doesn't make any sense. And as he came out, you mean the Roman soldiers didn't see him? They were guarding the thing. You mean to tell me he was able to leave the tomb, walk into Jerusalem and walk around the town and the city to see and show himself to various disciples? I mean, what kind of shape would Jesus have been in? He was near death, if not dead. Again, I believe he was absolutely fully dead. But just imagine with me what kind of condition Jesus would have been in. Bleeding and gushing and weak. There's no way this body standing there is going to convince anybody he's raised from the dead. Not a chance. So there's zero possibility for the swoon theory. But that's one explanation. Another explanation is they say, oh, well, the disciples probably stole the body of Jesus. In fact, that was an explanation that the Jews, after the tomb was empty, they were so afraid of what the people would think if Jesus was raised and that was to spread. Man, their power would be threatened and they wouldn't be able to control. They already had a hard time controlling this Christian faith with Jesus on earth. Imagine if now they believed that Jesus was raised. What kind of influence would they be? So those Jews, the Jewish leaders, told the Roman soldiers who were guarding the tomb, and they gave them money. They said, don't worry about your life. We're going to make sure, you're taken care of. Just tell everybody that you fell asleep and that when you're sleeping, the disciples came and they stole the body. So Matthew records this in the last chapter of Matthew in verse 13. And so they took the money, the soldiers, and did as they were instructed. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. So it was something that was reported that the disciples stole the body. So that was the explanation. By the way, that by itself tells us again that the tomb was empty, that nobody could account for the body of Jesus, because even the enemies of Jesus was trying to give an explanation for the empty tomb, and they came up with the story the disciples stole it. And by the way, one piece of evidence for why we know that was a lie was that the Roman soldiers were still alive after the fact. If they really went to sleep while they were on duty, then they would have at least, you think of dishonorable discharge, yeah, that would be nice for a Roman soldier. They would have been punished, imprisoned, possibly put to death. So no wonder the Jews said, you know what, we're going to take care of you, because they had influence and clout in Jerusalem, so they promised the soldiers, nobody will harm you, here's some money, just tell people this story. Well, anyway, so the fact that Matthew says this is told even among Jews to this day tells us again, they couldn't find the body of Jesus. They had no idea where it was. So the tomb was empty. Where was the body of Jesus? So again, just negating that so-called swoon theory and all that. But be that as it may. So were they right? Maybe, is that true that the disciples stole the body? Maybe Matthew is saying that they lied about it, whereas Matthew's biased or something, and that's what the disciples really did do. Well, number one, that denies and defies history, the historical evidence we do have. We absolutely have zero reason to accept that or believe that is true. The only reason anyone would want to hold that view is because they were motivated to try to deny the possibility of the resurrection of Jesus. They're not motivated by the historical data. There's no facts that would point us to the fact that, or the idea that disciples stole the body. There would be no motivation to believe this. Except, oh, I just want to deny the resurrection, so let me come up with that. It's the same reason people today who try to believe that the disciples stole the body have the same motivation that the Jews did in the first century. We need to discredit the message that Jesus was raised from the dead. No. But the second thing is not only does it defy the history, the records, but it also denies common sense. Think about this. What reason would the disciples have to steal the body? What was their motivation? They were believing in Jesus. They were believing his teachings, to be sure. But then would they want to fabricate something that they believed was right? In fact, and here's a point we don't want to miss. In fact, the Gospels give us every indication that the disciples did not expect Jesus to rise from the dead. They didn't understand even when Jesus would predict that. They didn't get it. Why? Notice who was at the tomb on Sunday morning when Jesus rose from the dead. Nobody. The Roman soldiers. None of the disciples were there just waiting and anticipating for Jesus to come out of that tomb. Nobody was there. Why? We would all be there if we believed that he was about to be raised from the dead. We'd wait there for weeks. Hey, when is this going to happen? We believe it. Nobody was there. Why not? Because they thought it was a done deal. The disciples of Jesus were giving up. They thought, and if you read, like for example in Luke chapter 24, there's two of the disciples leaving Jerusalem on their way to Emmaus, another town. And Jesus was raised from the dead, according to Luke's account, and Jesus met them on the road as they were leaving. And they said things like, because they didn't recognize who Jesus was, he hid himself, his identity to their minds, according to Luke. But the point is, they were leaving, and they were depressed. They were down about what happened. Why? Because they lost hope. Because they said, we had thought that Jesus was the Messiah. We had thought that he was the Messiah. But we were wrong. So they were going back home. Look at all the disciples. They were basically going back to their own businesses. They were going back home. They thought it was over. The only reason the message got out, well, as far as the initial reason why the message got out, is because many of the women that followed Jesus went back to the tomb, not because they thought Jesus would be raised from the dead. They went back to the tomb thinking that his body was still going to be there, and hey, he was buried so quickly they didn't have time to honor his body and give fragrances and so forth, as was traditional at that time. So they wanted to go there. They were trying to figure out even who's going to move the stone when we get there. These women, there's 3 or 4 women there. The text kind of is questionable about that. 3 or 4 women would not have been able to move the stone. And like I said, a weak and near dead Jesus wouldn't have been able to either. But they knew that. So they were going to try to figure it out when they get there. But they get there, and the stone was rolled away, and the soldiers weren't there, and the tomb was empty, and they're thinking, what happened? And so they run, and long story short, they went back to tell the disciples, the 12 disciples, that the body was missing. It wasn't there. And so Peter and John ran up and to try to see if that was indeed the case. So nobody expected the resurrection to happen. So, if that's true, why then, 50 days later, if they had lost hope, and they thought they didn't anticipate a resurrection, they weren't motivated by thinking that would happen to try to come up with this, because they didn't think it was going to happen in the first place. But why then, 50 days later, about a month and a half later, they're in Jerusalem, all of the disciples and those women are in Jerusalem preaching the resurrection of Jesus? What happened between the empty tomb and 50 days later? What happened when they're basically depressed, thinking it was all over, going back home, certainly not anticipating a resurrected Jesus, because they're not at the tomb for sure. The women even just going back to help to figure out what to do with the body. But Somewhere along the way, that was their mindset. And then 50 days later, they're preaching Jesus is raised. What happened? Well, the text tells us that it's because they saw on many occasions, they saw the raised Jesus. Jesus was raised from the dead. That makes sense of their behavior now, 50 days later, a month and a half later, where they're willing to die for that message. So, did they just steal the body? No. Why would they lie about it? Why would they lie about something, number one, they didn't expect in the first place, and number two, why would they lie about something where it would be a message that would just make their life miserable? I mean, the message that they preached gave them so much trouble by family members, by neighbors, by everybody in society. They ended up being persecuted, rejected. Certainly their businesses would have hurt because people around didn't want anything to do with them. And then on top of it, they were kicked out of the synagogues as far as being in fellowship with them anymore, but they would still go and they would preach the Gospels and so forth. But the Jews kept persecuting and rejecting the disciples. So why would they lie about it? What would be the motivation? No, that makes no sense whatsoever. So, the disciples did not steal the body. Jesus didn't just swoon alive. Well, then some unbelievers have explained, well, maybe the enemies of Jesus stole the body. Well, that really doesn't make any sense at all. Because why would they do that? That would just be self-defeating. I mean, they didn't want people to believe that Jesus was raised. Why would they do the very thing that would cause people to believe Jesus was raised? No, they wanted the opposite. They didn't want people to think that. So the enemies of Jesus, no, not a chance. The disciples of Jesus, no, not a chance. They did not steal the body. But then, here's something to add to that. The Apostle Paul. He is one of my favorites when it comes to eyewitness testimony. By the way, you may think, well, I didn't see Jesus. You didn't see Jesus. Are we just relying on a book? I mean, is that valid to rely on the message of an ancient book and believe that? Absolutely, it makes sense to do that. In fact, eyewitness testimony is the very thing that is most important when it comes to criminal courts and juries today. Juries and judges today never themselves saw the crime that they're having to make a judgment on. They weren't there. So what do they have to do? They have to weigh the evidence. What evidence do they weigh? What is one of the most important and critical things? If you can have eyewitnesses, multiple eyewitnesses, that is absolutely credible. And then they test, okay, is there some reason for these eyewitnesses to lie? Is it credible? And those are good questions. Well, we already noted there was no conflict of interest with the disciples. There was no motivation for them to lie. But on top of that, there was every motivation for them to give up the message. If they were lying about it, they would say, okay, whoa, don't kill me. This is a lie. I mean, how many people do you know would be willing to suffer as much as they did and even die for a message they knew was a lie? You might find one or two people that might, maybe, I don't even think you find anybody. But all of these people, because Paul the Apostle in 1 Corinthians 15 said at one time there was 500 people that saw Jesus alive. He was seen by all the 12 disciples, and Paul said, last of all, he was seen by me. Paul saw Jesus as well, and he wasn't one of the original 12. So Jesus shows up to a lot of people. All right, so that just doesn't make sense. The disciples did not steal the body. And their eyewitness testimony, what we have is they're writing down their disposition. Think of the Gospels as dispositions that they wrote down to bear evidence to the fact that they were eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. That's the primary purpose for there being 4 Gospels, not just one. You think of multiple attestation. And that's really important when you think about that. So by the way, real quick, there was another explanation that even today I know of one particular scholar, so-called scholar, historian, who says, well, and he's not the only one, of course, the one I'm thinking of, because there was others that kind of say that. Maybe they just, okay, yeah, they see the point. Yeah, the disciples didn't steal the body. The enemies of Jesus didn't steal the body. But maybe something happened to the body we don't really know. And maybe maybe those were hallucinations. They saw Jesus, they believed they saw Jesus, but they didn't really. They just hallucinated. Those were illusions. They just saw it. Well, that might be true. That can happen for one person, maybe even two or something like that. That might be an explanation. But to say that that happened to all 12 of the disciples, to say that that happened to Paul, who was not originally one of them, to say that that happened to all the women who followed Jesus, to Mary, his own mother, for example. I mean, why would his mother lie about this whole thing? By the way, she was one of them that says that she saw Jesus raised. And if she didn't say that, then that wouldn't be recorded, because again, that would be easy to refute. Why would the apostles, why would Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John put that point in there that Mary saw him too, if that wasn't true? It would be easy to discredit that. Just go and talk to Mary. Oh, she would say. Christianity would have never got off the ground if they were lying about that. And besides, Christianity would have never got off the ground at all if Jesus was not raised. It would have been a dead religion who died in the first century with Jesus. Like we said, they didn't anticipate a resurrection in the first place. There would be no reason to continue to preach Christianity. It would have been a dead religion in the first century. No, something happened that converted all of these disciples. And something happened to convert Paul. That becomes one of the most important and critical conversions, because Paul had everything to lose and nothing to gain to begin to preach Christianity. You remember, he was climbing the ladder of success in Judaism. And he was influential. He had everything going for him. He was a Pharisee. He was climbing the ladder to become a ruler of the rulers, and had everything going. And all of a sudden, for no explanation, he just gives all that up. Because he was persecuting Christianity. And he was either killing or approved of the killing of Christians, and in jail and so forth. He was a persecutor. And then all of a sudden, within a matter of days, weeks, all of a sudden he is now preaching the truth that Jesus was raised from the dead. So in addition to those disciples, the explanation, now we got to explain Paul. Why would he change the message? And why would he had everything going for him, and he gave all of that up for a lie? He gave all that up for nothing? In fact, he gave that up for now a life of persecution and eventual death. Tradition has it that Paul was beheaded by Nero in Rome for preaching. All of that, and he was left for near dead in Lyconium and Lystra. And anyway, long story short, because I know I'm running out of time here, but there's no explanation of the change that we see in Paul, except for the truth of what he saw. Clearly, Paul believed he saw the resurrection of Jesus. Clearly, those disciples believed they saw the resurrection of Jesus. Clearly, Jesus' mother saw her son raised from the dead. Clearly, the other women saw this. No reason for any of them to lie. It would be ridiculous to think they're all just imagining this and hallucinating. That's just beyond anything that's common sense. And you just have to be so desperate to not believe Jesus was raised in order to believe that. So desperate. All right, so what's the explanation? Well, the tomb was empty, just historically. We know that that's true. What is the explanation for this? Just looking at it historically, the best conclusion, the best and most probable conclusion, just historically, is that he's got to be raised. He's raised from the dead. And that's exactly what I believe. And I hope you do too, because it's true. And aside from the historicity of it, that's an important point, but I do think that there are prior probabilities that God would do something like this. If God exists and we're established that he does, and that's what we're assuming in this particular lesson, but we've talked about it before. If God exists and he created the world, and as we talked about before, he would be a God of love, a God who is interested in his creation. He wouldn't be a deity far off somewhere. He would be invested because he made us to love and to be in relationship. So he must be interested in relationship. He would want to commune. But here's the problem. We've sinned, and if this God is truly a holy God, he can't just be in fellowship. And here's the other thing. How do we explain a loving God and the problem of evil? Death is a real problem for humanity. Are we saying God doesn't care and he's just letting all humans die and that's it? That doesn't make sense. It's just I'm just saying this is an added point to think about. So there's prior probabilities to me that God, a loving God, would want to do something about the sin problem. He would want to do something about the thing that hurts human beings, his creation, most. Suffering and death. Now, there's different ways he could do that. We're going to talk about suffering in a separate lesson. But at the end of the day, the best explanation for what God would do to a world of suffering and death is defeat death by coming into this world and being and living that holy life so that we could ask God to account that life as ours, as our sacrifice. This is what we want to offer. The life that Jesus offered, we want that to be our life. And that's what it is to be a Christian. We are accepting. That's what faith is. Accepting and believing that Jesus Christ lived that sinless life and that he died the death that I deserve and that he rose from the dead, defeating death, and now showing that as I participate in him and I believe and accept that, I can also defeat death because of his promises. What a beautiful story. And it just is so powerful. The best sense I can make of this is that it's true. All right. I know it's a little bit longer here, but thank you for joining with me. We'll talk more about other questions and concerns about some of this as we go along, but thank you for joining me. If you like this, click the like button. If you have any comments or questions, put them in the comments box. I will look at them and respond to you. Plus, by the way, if you have any questions at all, if you have anything you would like for me to discuss or deal with in these videos, put them in the comments box. I want to hear from you, and I will deal with it. There's no bad or dumb question. There's plenty of dumb answers, and I might give some of those, but there's no dumb question. And I want to hear from you. And if you'd like for me to address something, and we'll certainly put that in the comments box. But also subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you so much, and have a blessed day.